So to help us look at that in a bit more detail is Fabia, our next speaker, who's going to tell us a little bit about the Global Farm Metric tool and explain how to use that framework to understand, measure and monitor the impact of on-farm activities. Fabia Bromovsky is the Strategic Advisor at the Sustainable Food Trust and the Global Farm Metric Director. Fabia joined the Sustainable Food Trust to take the Global Farm Metric tool to the next stage of consensus, because that's a key aspect of it, and obviously adoption, and to chair the Global Farm Metric Coalition Working Group. Fabia is also a board member and trustee for several family offices, and prior to her role at a Sustainable Food Trust, she spent 30 years at the helm of Waddesdon and latterly at the CEO of the Rothschild Foundation. So we're really, really pleased to have Fabia to talk to us today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Fabia.
Very, very nice to be here. This used to be my office up there, and I actually witnessed this changing from an old cowshed, very appropriately, into the very beautiful place it is now, so it just shows how old I am. So what I want to do today with the Global Farm Metric, I mean, I think I know some of you definitely have listened to some of this process of discussion about creating a common framework that we can all use to help us navigate our way through, as Alice says, this incredibly complex transition in which the language, to start off with, is one of the most complicated things. And I think this conversation about the Global Farm Metric actually started while I was still here at the Rothschild Foundation and at Waddesdon, and was initially having conversations with Adele and Patrick Holden at the Sustainable Food Trust, where I now found myself. And it was us as a big estate here saying, where do you start? Everywhere you go, someone tells you something different. And, as a sort of science-based family, as a family of Rothschilds who were really deep in the weeds of the science and technology of the environment, how do you actually prove, how do you understand whether the changes we decide to make really have the impact we want? I mean, after all, nobody has been farming for the last 50 years with the intention to damage the environment in any way. But we were following the knowledge we had at the time, and we were following the imperatives at the time, which was we need to feed. We needed more food post-war, and we needed to have cheap food. It became a really, really important driver. And it's only latterly, because we were not keeping our eyes on everything, that we started to understand that what we were doing was having impacts that we were not considering at the time. So that was the kind of framing, that's where we're going to start. So today I'm going to give you a little bit of an idea of the theory of a global farm metric, and also where we've got to and how you might be able to engage with this idea and work with us to develop it into something more tangible for you all. So that's me. And it's interesting on language. We probably started working on this. I can remember the first meeting we had actually here at the archive was in 2015. In that time, all the language has changed. I don't think anyone was talking about regenerative then. I don't think we were really even talking about soil. So where the Global Farm Metric is attempting to be is to be a holistic framework. We have all suffered from needing to consider one aspect of our farming system. And the problem with considering one aspect is while you're focused in one direction, you're potentially having all sorts of unintended consequences in the other. We're right on that precipice all over again with carbon. We can go and chase that carbon rainbow, net zero, a really important target. But the likelihood is if we focus just on that, those eucalyptus trees in Scotland, the consequences in a very short time will be apparently not so good. The approach of the Global Farm Metric has been to try and navigate some of the conversations that I'm sure we'll have today, which is very often, and many of the ways that we've assessed our farming systems for the last 10 years have been about practice. Do this, and this is what we hope will happen. Now, practice is absolutely the levers of change. We have to understand what to do in order to try and improve the system. But what the Global Farm Metric is looking to do is to say, fantastic, let's make those decisions, but let's monitor the outcomes on the system of those practices over time to ensure that those decisions are delivering all the things that we set out for them to do. So one sort of milestone in the global farm metric is measuring outcomes rather than saying these are the practices we should adopt. Some of the positives of having a common language, having a common approach to this is you can create a baseline of data that you can monitor year on year. And the way we set out to try and achieve was to create a sort of DNA of our farming systems that we could then hold, help us understand, as Alice put so well, if you can't measure, you can't manage it, but also would be the currency, and I do mean that actually in financial terms as well, the currency that we can use to demonstrate the good practices we've done, the public goods that we've delivered. Note mission, we're really at this SFT mission-driven as much as anything else, is to establish this common framework so that everyone can adopt it, so that we create a system of data, once a dirty word, but now an essential of our food supply chains and our own needs. We want to build that from the bottom up and not have it imposed from the top down, which is happening very rapidly. So we've gone there. There are 1,001 different ways we can look at this. So why do we want one framework? We've talked about the complexity and the confusion. We've talked about overlooking that the system, every part of the system impacts the other. We have to look at the whole system. Looking at it in parts doesn't help. If we look at one part, it's overlooked. There's no consistent way that we've adopted so far to think about outcomes. Actually, what we're proposing is a very simple way of doing that, but I think we need to now look at the impacts of what we're doing if we have that baseline of data. So, whole farm is looking at your whole farm common language. The idea of creating this language is so that everyone adopts it. We're not looking to create a new tool. We'll come on to what we are doing to try and test this framework. We want this embedded in all the assessments you do, so that when you're doing your leaf assessment or your organic standards, that you're also not only looking at the practices and the questions that they're asking you to prove you've met a standard, but you're also monitoring your own progress against that standard and you're improving. Gone backwards, didn't mean to do that. Outcomes focused, evidence based. I'll go over how we've got here. It's been a long process, and if we were all looking at the same sets of information, if we could think about this information on a large scale, we'd actually begin to see the patterns emerging. This data is not straight line, and we need to understand what are the other things that are going on in our systems. Okay, so this is where we've got to, and anyone who's been following our work will know that we've done a lot of working with people to work out what is the system. What is the system that we're trying to protect? What is the system that we're trying to monitor? And just to explain the wheel as it sits here, you can look at it in a few different parts. You've got the natural systems, the systems of which you have an impact and you haven't got a huge amount of control. You've got the ability to improve them by the systems that you do. Your climate, and by this we don't mean greenhouse gas emissions, which has become a proxy for climate. We really mean the things that affect you every day on your farm. The rainfall, the drought, the floods, the length of the growing season, this year started so late. All of those things have as much as an impact on your system as some of the other choices you make. Somehow, they seem to have left the language because we're so busy talking about greenhouse gas emissions. Also important, but that's an impact of what we do. So you've got the natural parts of your system. You've got those other complicated things that, again, the governance, how you own your land, some of the decisions you decided to take. You might be an organic farmer. That restricts the choices you can make. There may be you might be in higher level schemes or whatever. So there are certain things that already narrow the landscape on which your choice takes place. You've got resources, your buildings, your equipment, all that kind of stuff. And the decisions you make about inputs. So they will have an effect on the whole system, on your yields, on good things. They will have other impacts, greenhouse gas footprints, etc., etc. So those are the things they are the tools that you have in order to build your system. And then you've got the farmers, the crops and pastures and the livestock, the reason you're in farming, the parts of the system that you're actually using to produce the products, both the food, the fibre, the fuels that you're there to produce, but also the byproducts, the waste products and the byproducts. So everything that comes out of your system, and the economics, after all, are only what the system values those at. That's the market. And so you cannot have a sustainable system, you cannot have a regenerative system, unless all of those things are connected, and the economics also has to be sustainable. So we need to look at the whole system as we go. When we started out on this journey, we were very much about outcomes, and we didn't acknowledge in our wheel the role of practices and impacts. The reason that we had moved, had not included those, was that when you talk about practice, all the kind of modelling and information is modelled. So you say, if I have a cover crop, this is what I imagine is going to happen, through lots of science, through lots of good previous data, but it's not what's actually happening in your system. So model data is a really important part. Carbon calculators are model data. You put in all the practices you do, all the inputs you put, and they model what your greenhouse gas emissions are likely to be. The data that you collect in the global farm metric as the primary data is actually the data that you can measure on your farm. So you're actually monitoring what's happening in your system. The farm practices are the levers that change, the things that you decide to do, and they will have impacts both on the system and outside the system, and those impacts need to be measured too, both to consider what your greenhouse gas emissions might be, for instance, but also the impacts the outside world have on your system. If you're upstream from a chicken farm, your rivers will be polluted from it, potentially, if we're on the Wye Valley. So there are things going on outside your farming system. And what the Global Farm Metric attempts to do is to make sure that the world acknowledges that. Because if we're going to go into a world where you might get rewarded for good practice, there's always the threat that one might get penalised for the outcomes. But they're not just coming from the farm system, and we need to therefore be really cognizant of that. So, sorry, too long on that. Perhaps this is just to say the framework is the theory. The framework says this is the system that we need to monitor, but actually useless in its own right. It's a lens to help understand. It's a lens to start thinking, oh my goodness, every decision I make is impacted by these things. It's a good starting point. But actually what most people want to do is how can I assess my system against this framework, and what can we do? So within the framework, you've got the indicators for the state of the system, which are up. I don't know why they came in that order. You've got subcategories below this which help you understand the areas that this covers. You've got the indicators that say this is if I measure against that, I can indicate whether this part of my system is in a good state, is potentially becoming more sustainable, more regenerative. And in order to inform that data point, that indicator, you need to collect data to do that. So that's the process. We are at the Sustainable Food Trust, as I say, have had a mission to say, how do we bring this data together? But in order to test, which we've been doing over the last 3 or 4 years, in order to test that framework collects data that is primarily useful to you to understand your system and measure your progress against it, we've needed to collect that data, translate that data back to farmers. And we've worked with a very, very lovely thing we call the GFM research tool, which was a kind of glorified spreadsheet. It was a bit more glorified than that. And we are now working with Anthesis, they were the home of the Cool Farm tool, to create a slightly more robust application tool. It'll be still fairly simple in order to collect the data and have that data, report on that data against it. But what we're also trying to do with this engine, again, we are not here to disrupt the system. We want to enable the system. because we've got a system that has been built around practice and collecting a certain type of data, and we want to support that with some more outcomes data, more data focused on the farm. And we're looking at ways that if you collect GFM data, that you can share that data with the other platforms, your carbon calculators, the other tools or certification schemes that you use, so that you don't have to collect the data twice. So that's why we call it the GFM engine. We're looking at ways that we can use the engine to exchange data with other platforms, and ultimately that's what's going to happen. But also allows looking at if you have this, if we all know where we're trying to collect data, how technology can come in and help us collect that data, remote sensing, etc. But we've started with it in the most basic way. So very, very quick look at the kind of way you go from the category of nature, subcategories, biodiversity, habitats and environmental habitats, indicators of that. Go to our website. We won't dwell on these now, and then we will within the application of it in the GFM engine, it will be more tangible still. So just to get back to the theory of change, the whole reason that we started on this process was if you could have this thread of data that we all understood to be a first line, a baseline of what our system looked like. For us as farmers, helps us to understand the sustainability of our system and the decisions we've made and the impacts of those. We could use it for evidence, for certifiers, buyers and governments, and hopefully better environmental incomes. Government as the basis of farm support. At the moment, we've got an endless supply of new things that they're going to supposedly pay us for, whether it's planting hedges or herbal lays or whatever it is. But what we're saying is they need to monitor the outcomes of those decisions we make, those things that are funded, to see whether they are actually delivering for us, with our public money, the outcomes for nature, for the planet that we've assumed, and they've assumed through practice that they will. Supply chain, beginnings of the basis of procurement standards can inform food labelling, So give one thread of data, and at last you've got some ground truthing to the kind of big data pools in the sky that are going on. So that's the theory of change. I think I've got to the end. We've been at this for a long time. Tim's in the room. He was one of our very, very early farmers who came and looked at what we should do through early days of agroecology. We started with farmers. What do we want? What do we want to try and understand about our system? Lots of talk with academia over the last 3 years, and particularly last year, really going through the science behind the indicators that we were choosing. We looked at all the tools that were out there, all the other frameworks. We're doing a big international project with absolutely this outcome. There is so many different people out there doing different things. But remember, a framework is just there to answer a question. They are not unique as a thing. Supply chain, we've worked with supply chain. There's an enormous amount of reporting coming down the line. How can we make them understand that they've got to use the data that exists at farm level and not keep demanding different data from different things? Farm advisors to help support this. It's all very well to know what's going on, but we need advice to know what to do next, which today is all about. And, government, please use this. Please help us organise around this. Okay, enough of me. We are doing trials. I would much prefer to ask questions. I am going to say that this year is very much about trialling the new framework, again, getting lots of feedback from farmers, but we've also got 2 or 3 trials going on with DEFRA about how they can use it with the certifiers and various things like that. And we've got some supply chain trials. So if there's any of those that you would be interested in joining, please let me know.
Great, thank you very much, Fabia. Really interesting to hear, sort of, as you say, to hear where it's got to, and that really critical area of measuring, and such a big area, and I imagine a massive challenge. Right, we've got good time for questions now. So whilst you're all thinking of your first one, I'm going to take Chair's prerogative and ask you, as someone who's kind of looked at this area a lot, how do you manage the conflict between what is easy and possible to measure and what is actually important to measure? Is that a kind of challenge that you're looking at, when you're looking at the individual metrics and what's possible to measure versus actually what's getting to the crux of the issue? Is that something you think about a lot?
So, I think my answer to that is we started with the framework, which is obviously what we think is important to keep your eyes on. But we have created something that one of the sort of defining parts of has been it's got to be possible to be collected as a self-assessment by a farmer on the ground. We've had lots of conversations, pushback, discussions around, what does a common language or a common framework mean unless you dictate how every piece of data is collected. And at first, that really, really worried me. Do we have to take a kind of approach like this, that you're going right to the last thing and then you take your spade and you dig that hole and you look at it in this way, and then someone says, but I've got a satellite that can do all that from the sky. And then you go and look into the other side of the world, not the farming world, but the world of ESG, for instance. The masses of billions or trillions of pounds we hear going into green investments. Or you even take the supply chain or the banks reporting on their Scope 3, even carbon emissions. The data that is going in to feed those enormous financial decisions is so imperfect, so unrelatable to what's going on in the ground. For us to understand the data we want to collect and be inspired to collect it the best we can is absolutely good enough for this moment. And also, I think that obviously if someone's going to pay you lots and lots of money for X or Y, they will set some standards around how you collect it.
Good. Thank you very much. And yeah, it's that don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You've actually got to make progress in this area. Question at the back.
I think probably everyone here would agree that this is exactly what is needed for there to be a kind of recognised standard that's holistic and does exactly what you just said, which is feeds into an up and running already nascent market. But in terms of the people collecting it, you mentioned a moment ago this will be farmers collecting it on the ground. Have you looked at how many man-hours that involves annually for an average size farm? And is that a realistic expectation? Or do you think that there will be another sort of agent market set up to come and do this baselining?
Lots of good questions and lots to unpack there. So we did all our trials with our research tool. And there are lots of things you discover when you actually do it on the ground. To say how long does it take will depend absolutely on how organised, what kind of other systems people have to put data into. So, if you've already worked out all your field margins, if you already know your soil types by area on your farm, there will be some easy wins fairly quickly. So what we found was the amount of man-hours it took was between 4 and 8, depending on how easy your data was accessible. But one of the things that doing an assessment year on year, some of them don't have to be done every year, but keeping that assessment going on a rolling programme, is 50% of the work only has to be done once. And then you just build on it. So it's like any good organised system, which most of our offices aren't. But if one had that perfect organised system with all the data in the right place, it becomes easier and easier to do. First thing. Obviously, we're just about to have a new application. Most definitely one of the things we're testing is how long does it take? How many things can you help? How much mapping systems and stuff could you build into an application? But if we're all after the same data, the technology market, can focus on that and make it easier and easier and easier for people to do that. So that's the theory of change. Ours will be the most simple end of it. One of the big learnings from our trials is everyone hates it. It's time-consuming to do. And I think we're also used to filling in assessments for somebody else. Oh my God, I've got to complete this for my rural payment scheme, my this, my that, my other. What this is about is doing it for yourself first, hoping it will feed into other things. And that understanding of why you're doing it gives it a very different perspective. So realising it's your system that you're measuring and it's your work that you're monitoring gives it a slightly different lens on actually that data collection, because it's not just a process that needs to be completed, but it's actually doing the process makes you more aware of the things that you need to consider. But farm advisors, whether it's your husband, your wife, your whatever as your farm advisor, or further, advice is, it's not enough just to have data, it's what do I do as a result of it. Farm clusters doing it together has been a very, very effective way of people beginning to understand a bit more about why does it work here and it doesn't work over there. I mean, it throws up more of the anomalies usually than this is very, very straightforward, as we all know. But so yes, our theory of change is that all the existing systems will adopt it, so that your farm advisors will have it as a tool in their toolbox. Your assessment schemes will adopt it. So what's there already should be enhanced by it and will help people find their way through it.
It's that sort of motivation and value piece in there, and that it's simple enough for people to do themselves, but how can you add value by working with others as well?
Exactly.
Great. And another question, Stephen.
You pose quite a lot of questions in my mind. One of which is actually the ambition around outcomes and measuring and monitoring outcomes, which I think we'd all probably subscribe to. But obviously outcomes are elastic. Those outcomes change with a whole range of different factors.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how is that reconciled against many of the programmes, let's call them for want of a better word, and schemes, government and private, require a level of certainty in terms of practice to reward that practice, whether that be financial or otherwise. So on one hand, you've got a very set prescription in terms of do this to achieve an outcome, yet we're trying to monitor outcomes which are a movable feast. How do we reconcile those things?
So which I think you're alluding to, we're talking about the sort of carbon credit markets, biodiversity net gain markets, and all those kinds of things that are out there. So that's one box. And I think we're all rightly nervous of those, because what they're saying is we expect what you do to produce whatever it is, X million tonnes of carbon over the next 30 years. Imperfect carbon modelling, who knows, and that worry about who's at risk here when it doesn't deliver on that. So in a way, I'm probably not answering your question quite, but what we're looking at is a quieter background noise of real data, which can, if we want it to, feed up into these big modelling machines to actually make the models reflect what is actually happening on the ground. So it will be a way of actually, I know we feel that out there there's a huge amount of data, but there's very, very little data that's really collected across all these things on farm at farm level. There's lots of, big modelling in the sky that says, this is the likely soil health in the water risk and whatever in California and different parts of the world, but it's very, very a long way from the ground, and it hides the worst performers, and it doesn't celebrate or allow for the people who are making change and doing things differently. So there's that. So what we're trying to do is, again, with all our supply chain talks, is ask them to rely on this real data, the practices that you're following, so that they can actually support and understand those lack of straight lines in the system. So what we've been talking to DEFRA about is reward farmers for collecting data, not whether it's good data or bad data, but just the fact that they're beginning to help that data pool. That would be one way of doing it. And for the supply chain, the same. They're going to have to report on all sorts of Scope 3 impacts that they don't have and supposedly manage those Scope 3 impacts. If they want you to help them do that, they need to reward you for that data and for that practice. So we need to make people understand the difference between the model, the hypothetical, and what's actually going on the ground, and how it's impacted by things that, like the weather.
Yes, your comment, this data is not a straight line, is pretty important. Yeah.
And the only, for all of you who might think, gosh, this sounds like an interesting thing to do. It's not interesting to do for a year. It's interesting to have that record of what is really going on the ground over time, because it will be the things that you don't expect that will be the interesting things about doing it.
Brilliant, thank you. Yes, question back. If you could say again who you are and where you're from.
Good morning. Will Pratt from King's Crops. I think with the gathering of data as well, I think one of the important bits is not to get bogged down about industry level. I think when you're on farm level, it's about identifying what's actually needed on your farm, what are you monitoring, what's actually happening on your farm and in your area, and not worrying on to... it can become quite daunting when you think about what is needed or what's happening in industry level, but sometimes it's just down to basics. Are you doing a fresh weight cut down on your cover crop? What water catchment area are you in? What wildlife is or isn't there? It's coming down to what's happening on your parcel of land that you're responsible for, and not worrying too far down the chain in some ways.
Absolutely right, and one of the reasons to be looking at what you're doing and what's the impact for you is that you will be doing, we'll hear today about so many different ways one could try and solve this problem, and the joy of looking beyond just what you're doing is that you can encompass all those different things. I completely agree, and what we've got to look at is create a system that is robust enough that all those people who are asking endless questions from the up down, depending on trends and biodiversity is the current new boy on the block, carbon's always out there. We need to look at the system constantly as a whole and not keep on coming for different bits of information. And we should be able to use the information we have, not the information that they're demanding, so that we, as I say, we build the foundation up.
Take the ownership of what's
there. Yeah. And maybe not give it to anybody. We've got to make sure it's useful first for us in the room, and then be able to share it if we choose.
Great. Yes, another question, sorry.
Me again.
Yeah.
I just want to ask about DEFRA and how receptive they are to this, because of course they're key to it. And a moment ago you said, we presumably would all like to be in a position where they're paying us to collect data. But at the moment, under the SFI, if I've understood it, Stephen will know, under the soil option and the water one, I have to pay for somebody to come and inspect my plan. So they're not even willing at the moment to pay for their own people to come and inspect it. I have to, as a landowner. Are we going to get them to move from that position to a point where they're paying us to collect data?
First question is, who is DEFRA? There are so many different people.
Yes, and we have one in the room. So, Daniel, do you want to come back on that?
I'm Daniel de Cruz, I'm from DEFRA, and what you'll see later when I give my presentation after lunch is that, to answer the point made earlier, we're paying on inputs rather than outcomes. Now, we're very interested in this because clearly we want to encourage outcomes, but we recognise that the data isn't there at the moment. But to your point, we have just introduced the SFI management fee, which is retrospective as well, which I know is not necessarily paying you for all the things that you talked about, but it is recognition that there is an administration and a time issue in all the requirements of the SFI and other schemes.
So our DEFRA trial, to give DEFRA their due, is very much focused on what support do farmers need to collect this data. How much does it cost? So that's actually one of the big outcomes from the trials. They've actually allowed us to go off piece too, because what we're saying to them is having this data means that you, rather than have a bunch of scientists go and review some of the different kinds of schemes that are out there in some reports it's on a shelf, would be a way of monitoring across the piece all the decisions people take for schemes and whether the outcomes from those schemes are delivering something that's useful.
Yeah, good, that FAF factor. Good to keep that conversation open in terms of what's feasible. Yes, sir.
Hi, Will McLennan, Farm Manager, North Buckinghamshire. Just following on from what the government can do for us, I wrote down farmer supply chain procurement, and it's the procurement thing that I was quite interested in. You said you speak to the supply chain a lot. What are they saying? Do they want this? Because if they want this, and we can be, and they're our customer, they can monetise it, and we can monetise it as well. That's what I was thinking.
That is absolutely the perfect solution. In our work in the Sustainable Food Trust, a lot of work around this buzzword of financing the transition. Where is, if, as we hear, no doubt get it this afternoon, where's the new revenue for farming in this different way? If we're going to farm for nature, if we're going to farm for public goods, if we're going to do all of these things for other people, where will this new money come from? So in an ideal world, that's exactly what should be happening. We should be getting some government support for being able to actually help really give a roadmap to what's going on the ground. There should be supply chain support for producing goods from a better food system and also reducing their scope 3 impacts that they have to manage. So that's the ideal world, and I'm very surprised someone hasn't put their hand up saying, yes, but we know that the supply chain will start demanding this and it will become a condition and not a benefit. All of those things are at play here, but we have to drive that to ensure that that isn't the case, that we can get that fair equity within the supply chain, which is hard to do. Is everyone interested in this? There is a whole new industry in food supply chains in the big companies, which is sustainability. I'm not doing any of them down. Clever people in there trying to move the dial on changes to the way they procure and the impacts that they have. Does it get all the way up to the top? Yeah. Yes in words, whether in practice. There is such a lens at the moment on carbon as the only kind of benchmark to meet. There's so many pledges out there that they've got to deliver against that I would say sometimes that gets fragmented. But they are in the whole mess of labelling and all the rest. And again, if we had a common thread of information, all of those things are more solvable. The conversation goes on loudly in all of them. Change happening, slower. One more thing just to say on that. Really, the top of the supply chain work through lots of our certification schemes, Red Tractor, Leaf, all of those. More and more people will say their Leafs. What we've got to do is make sure that we can use those existing players in the supply chain to feed that data into and help them use the right data. It's remaking the landscape.
So many different layers there in terms of supply of data and demand of data, and chicken and egg on that score.
All of these people say they need this and they want it. So the conversation's live. The delivery of all of these things is more complicated.
Phil.
Quick question. I'm Phil White. I'm farming Phil's on tape. I'm just interested to know. Brilliant presentation. Thank you, Fabia. I'm really interested to know that in your work so far, have you had any insights into how you're going to change farmer behaviour? Because if farmers are anything like me, there's real work, which is moving those cows, planting that crop of wheat or whatever. And then there's the chore, which is probably way more important, doing my cash flow budget, which I still haven't done, or, having to fill in my BPS form, thank God for that, last time ever, which always gets left to the last minute because it's just a pain. Now, how do we, because you've made a really convincing argument that this is for our own benefit, so how are we going to change that mentality we've all got, that office stuff, that's not real work, and make it something we do as a priority?
So, a very complicated conversation, and one that we are definitely working. It's a very, very long process change, and really, the change starts from education. And so, from this sort of theory of a global farm metric, and let's take A rather than a global farm metric, understanding the system, that has to percolate down in the way we learn. We think about the systems before as we learn to farm. And all of that. If we go through our trials, the motivator for everyone is money. Who's going to pay me for this? If someone's going to pay me, well, hey, this might be interesting. But I think what we've actually found with the farmers that we've worked with, and don't let's be naive. We tend to work with people who want to work with us. So you're working with a group of the converted, not completely in our West trials, and taking us out to much more curmudgeonly. People, is that by giving you, by ordering your thinking, by giving you a process and actually we started doing this partly with agroecology at the beginning, of thinking about these things throughout the year. You don't have to fill this in on one horrible, wet February day thinking, but it can be a process of collecting data through the year when it's the right time to do it. It's actually beginning to make you more engaged with this as a part of your process, as a part of the, you'll understand your farm through the way you see it, but this is a way of capturing some of those observations. But it will take time, and many people say, I know all this stuff, why do I need to measure it? And they're right, but there's very little thing to evidence the good work you've done. Tim, in
Brilliant.
background.
Yes, one last question, Tim.
Tim Field, facilitator of the North East Cotswold Farm Cluster, who are doing a landscape recovery project at the moment. So I'm just going to interesting what Phil said there, and I'd say this exercise isn't just about measuring outcomes or what's going to happen over 10 years, but actually doing the exercise can very much inform your decision-making process and management process on farm. And I think that's some of the early days thinking, is that let's not just focus on yield here, but what are the other outcomes, and how understanding my farm system can inform management decisions. And with that, we are considering potentially using it as the baselining for landscape recovery. So my question is, how close are we to a minimum viable product?
July.
How about that answer?
But, and all the early adopters of that will be helping in the process of making that better.
Okay, one last question. Sure.
Hi, Paul Dovey. I'm a farm advisor, but I also work for SACS, Soil Association Exchange. We use the global farm metric. Quick question. I audit lots of farms, and one of the things farmers say is, how are we going to reduce our methane emissions from livestock? Why are we lumped in with the fossil fuel industry, also methane emitters, why are we lumped in with them? Apart from breeding genetics, more productive animals and feed supplements, what do we do?
So what you're measuring in the metric is all the decisions, the feed you use, the amount of time you're out there grazing. So you'll capture the processes that you're following and measuring those. You will still use a carbon calculator to look at the impact of that methane, because that will be modelled data. But what you'll be doing is, by modulating your practices, by changing your feedstock, you realise that by bringing your imported soya, you've immediately brought an enormous carbon footprint, not the methane bit, onto your farm, and therefore creating yourself a problem before you start. Those are the things you'll be able to observe. You'll be able to roughly understand from your global farm metric where the big impacts are, but your carbon calculator will tell you the other things. But in terms of practice, that's what we're all here to discuss. How can we, through the different practices, to the different feeds we use, different methods of grazing, whatever, different breeding, can we also in a more scientific way reduce what's coming out of our livestock?
Yeah, and I think that is, as Fabia's teed up for the next session, we're going to look at that practice a little bit more. But yes, that I think, and that last comment about making farmers, or encourage farmers having to want to do this and need to do this for business critical reasons is really, really crucial, rather than falling into another thing you have to do. I think it's brilliant to hear that you're working with so many people on how what does that look like and how do you promote that. So thank you very much, everyone, for all your questions, and thank you very much, Fabia, for a really brilliant presentation, a testament to the amount of questions and chat that we've got more time for now over the coffee breaks. We've got 15 minutes, but a big round of applause for Fabia.